everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Evidence-Based Marketing, Why You Need It, How to Do It, and How to Use It. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Before we start the program, I'll just go over a few quick housekeeping items. We are going to be taking questions throughout the webinar today. Often we hold questions until the end of the presentation, but today we'd like to take them throughout. So whenever a question comes up for you, please send it to me using the question feature on your control panel. I'll be keeping an eye out for those questions and interjecting them as they come in. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please use that same question feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be providing you with a recording of the webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint slides, so keep an eye on your inbox for a link to those later today or tomorrow. We'll also be posting them on the Agile website, which is at agile-ed.com. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers, Ellen Bialo, President of Interactive Educational Systems Design, also known as IESD, and Dr. J. Sivin-Kachala, who is Executive Vice President of IESD. For nearly 30 years, Ellen and Jay have worked with a wide range of educational publishing and technology businesses to execute quantitative and qualitative research projects. Using a variety of research methodologies, including focus groups, surveys, structured interviews, and comparison group evaluation, IESD has contributed to the success of companies ranging from Apple Computer and Follett to Apex Learning and the Committee for Children. Ellen has served the education publishing community as a chair of the SIIA Education Section Board of Directors, an advisor to the National Science Foundation, an industry awards judge for EdNet and the Association of Educational Publishers, and a member of the School Tech Exposition and Conference Advisory Board. Ellen founded the Dolls Community, a women's professional organization in the educational technology industry. She earned the QED Pinnacle Mentoring Award for her work in mentoring young professionals in the market, and in 2009 she was awarded the first Education Technology Impact Award ever given by SIIA. Prior to founding IESD, Ellen spent almost a decade in the classroom teaching mathematics at both the junior and senior high school levels. She received her graduate degree in educational psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University. Ellen will be joined today by Jay, whose work has been widely published, including by Scholastic, SIIA, and the National Science Foundation. Both Ellen and Jay have contributed to publications produced by ISTE, the U.S. Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and Technology and Learning magazine. Jay was a teacher of English language arts and remedial reading in an inner-city high school for many years. He received his doctorate in technology and education from Teachers College, Columbia University. With ESSA upon us, research and efficacy studies are becoming more important than ever as part of our sales, marketing, and product development. So we're excited to have Ellen and Jay with us today to share some information about how we can start to be showing evidence of success in what we're sharing with educators. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to them now.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're happy to have you. Jay and I are going to kind of bounce back and forth and do different parts of the presentation, but as Emily said, please jump in with any questions you might have. So the first slide gets us started with a framework of talking about evidence-based marketing. And evidence-based marketing is any kind of evidence that you can use and provide to show that your product is effective or it's likely to be effective. And there are three important areas that we're going to discuss today. One is foundations research, and we're going to explain what it is, how you do it, all that. Case studies, especially case studies that have data as part of what you're reporting. And the third is efficacy research. And now we're going to talk about each of those. So first, let's start with foundations research. So foundations research is kind of a review or a summary of research on what works. It might also include expert opinion about what works. And this is really prior research on methods, approaches, or features that you have incorporated into your product. And again, it's always about providing evidence that the product is effective or likely to be effective. The second is case studies. And I'm sure you've all seen case studies. They kind of tell a story about what's going on, quotes from teachers based on interviews that you've conducted. But what really makes a case study essential, I would say, or really, shows effectiveness is if you can include data that shows some positive outcomes based on students using your program. The third is efficacy research, and we've all heard about this. It tends to be a little intimidating. It's quite expensive to do. It takes a real investment of time and money. But this is scientifically based research that establishes that your product has really achieved the desired learning outcomes. Some companies invest in this research, and they have independent researchers do it. The reason for having an outside independent researcher do it is so that there's no bias. Obviously, if you do research on your own product and you say it's effective, well, who knows if, you know, what kind of job you've done on it. It's you saying it works versus somebody who's independent saying it works. When you do efficacy research, it's really got to be rigorous. It's usually a comparison between a target product and whatever the regular or typical standard way of teaching and learning is. So with that overview, let's go on, and I'm going to do a quick poll with you. And what I'd like to ask you is the following. What kinds of evidence research has your organization done? Foundations research, case studies with data showing positive outcomes, efficacy research, maybe something other than this, or you haven't done any. So if you would, please respond to the poll that's on your screen now. And we're asking you to select one. So if you've done more than one, select the one that's been most important or most effective, and then we'll talk about the results of the poll in a minute. Okay, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you in a moment once people respond. Oh, actually, we have results right now. Okay, let's. Jay, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's not surprising that more people have familiarity with case studies than the other kinds. And what I find interesting is that there are foundations research is kind of lower down in the percentages, and that's something that most companies can be doing and should be doing.
I also find it interesting, Jay, that almost 1/4 of the people say that efficacy research is something that they've done, because we find that that's true efficacy research is not done all that often, so that's kind of surprising to me.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can go on to our next slide. So we just want to think briefly about why you need evidence-based marketing. I'd say that ever since, especially No Child Left Behind, it's created an environment where education decision makers are seeking out products that have evidence of success, or at least evidence of likely success. And if you've got a solid evidence case, it gives you a competitive advantage. And in the case of efficacy research, it can qualify you for federal or state grant funding that you might not otherwise qualify for. So those are things to consider. Let's talk a little bit about ESSA. That's the next slide. Yeah, ESSA has put out guidance on evidence-based interventions. Pardon me. So there's some language in here. It talks about requiring at least one study that provides strong evidence, moderate evidence, promising evidence of effectiveness, or at least demonstrates a rationale. And so let's just talk about what this all means. In this case, an intervention refers to an education program or product that you want to sell to schools and districts. And strong, moderate, and promising evidence, there are levels of the strength of evidence. We can go to the next slide. Strong evidence refers to experimental studies. These are studies that compare two groups, one that experiences your education product and one that doesn't. And in an experiment, a true experiment, sometimes called a random control trial, the student subjects are assigned to either one group or the other group at random. And that way, if the data show that the group using your product outperformed the other group, it's unlikely that it's due to some factor other than your product. Moderate evidence refers to a quasi-experiment, which is similar to an experiment except that the groups are not assigned at random. Instead, they're assigned so that they have similar characteristics, and then researchers use statistical methods to try to adjust for any known differences. It's considered weaker than a true experiment because there might be some differences between the groups that you haven't accounted for, and therefore you haven't eliminated all the other possible explanations other than your program being so great. Promising evidence is correlational research, and that typically involves one group. A typical correlation research might be established that comparing before you use the product to after you use the product and finding that there was some big statistical gain. But again, because it's not comparing to something else, it doesn't eliminate the possibility of other factors causing the gain. They talk about selection bias, and that's when the sample being analyzed ends up not representing the entire population that you're trying to make a claim about. So that's something to be careful about. And finally, when they talk about demonstrating a rationale, for your purposes, that's really referring to foundational research. So if the product has good research underpinnings, then at least you can claim that it's likely that the program will have positive outcomes. Now we're going to talk more specifically about Research Foundation's white papers. Ellen, it's all
Jay,
up to you.
actually, before you guys move on, we did have one question that came in about ESSA. Are there study size requirements under the law? Has there been any kind of definition of what's considered a valid study for efficacy?
Well, I just want to say one thing about that. As Jay was discussing, the minimum requirement for acceptance of an education product for funding under ESSA is to have a Research Foundation's white paper. So that's something to keep in mind. But Jay, you might have something to add to that.
You know, they didn't really speak to it. Generally speaking, a large national study is better, you know, from a research perspective to smaller studies. But strategically, you may want to think about planning over a couple of years a number of small studies, because there isn't really that specific guidance. And if you have one study and you can't afford a national study, but you can afford one well-designed focus study, that's better than nothing. And then if you can do another one, let's say in another year, then you start to develop kind of a set of research. And a lot of research experts talk about developing a body of research over time. So those are things to consider.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and also, I mean, we don't know how this is going to change. I mean, I think, you know, whatever they're saying now is not necessarily what they may be saying in 3 months. So I think, you know, the jury is still a little bit out on this as well. But I definitely agree with Jay. You go in the direction of creating a body of research where you're building a case for your product.
And if we had to guess, it might get looser. The rules might get looser than tighter with the new administration.
Right.
We had a sort of a follow-up question that touches on what Jay said. In terms of efficacy, do we need to have separate studies for each population? So, you know, special ed, English language learners, struggling learners, or is it more of a global type of study?
You know, if it's a large enough study, you can be looking at those as subpopulations to see how they performed. Sometimes the nature of your product may be that you want it to focus on a particular population. One of the studies that we did kind of looked at a population at large, but then we divided it between kind of struggling students coming into the study and students who were more successful. And that allowed us to say something about struggling students, even though we didn't find positive results across all students.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. I think we're good for now to move ahead.
Great. Okay, good. Keep those questions coming. We're happy to have them. It makes it more interactive, and we can kind of answer your questions along the way as opposed to waiting until the end. So we were going to talk a little bit about Research Foundation's white paper. and what the actual purpose is. And obviously that is to show that the instructional methods and approaches are research-based, as we talked about. I just want to, again, reiterate that, as Jay discussed on the last slide, this is the minimum requirement for acceptance of an ed product for funding under ESSA right now. And in a lot of school districts, this is minimally what they want to see, so that they sometimes, can go ahead and check off that box that says, yes, this product is research-based. Even if you didn't do your own research, you're citing the research of others that supports your approach, your method, whatever. Also, as we think about a Research Foundations white paper, and we'll go into more detail on this, there are three main parts to it. One is a set of claims, figuring out what it is that you want to say about your product that can be supported by research. Second is evidence, finding those research studies that support the claims. And then third, how the product incorporates the research findings, that is, tying the research findings specifically to your product. Okay? And if you have any questions on that, let us know. We're going to go into a little more detail on that now. Jay?
Okay, so the next slide, please. So here you see three examples of the kinds of claims you might see in a Research Foundations white paper. And I'll just point out some things about them. A really strong claim ends up being, regardless of the words you use, a kind of if-then statement about instruction and learning. So for example, that first bullet could be translated as, if you provide beginning readers with explicit and systematic early literacy instruction, then their reading abilities will improve. In that if-then kind of thinking, then it's easy to target what research you're looking for and what kind of outcomes you're looking for in that research. Another example for that third bullet, if you incorporate formative assessment and progress monitoring to guide instructional decision making, then students will learn more and faster. Again, it makes it very easy for researchers to know, here's what we're looking for, here's the kind of inputs we're looking for in the research and the kind of outcomes we're looking for. Next slide. Let's spend a few minutes talking about types of evidence for Research Foundation white papers. Meta-analyses, these are statistical analyses of data across several separate studies, and usually they have a similar focus, and the purpose is to be able to draw a single conclusion that has greater power than each individual study might have. Early on we were asking about the size of studies. A meta-analysis may be looking at, for example, 3 really large-scale studies, but it might also incorporate 20 smaller studies, and then it can say something with great power. In terms of experiments and quasi-experiments, we've already discussed those, and as far as expert reviews and analysis, these often come in the form of systematic reviews of the research on a focused topic. And what they are is they present an expert's opinion or theory, but supported by multiple studies, which are often described in the review.
We have a quick question here, which you may be about to answer, but I wanted to clarify that this is not necessarily research about your product specifically, but about the topic that supports your product.
Yeah, in most cases it will not be about your product, and this is often done earlier, that even if you decide to commit lots of dollars towards your own research, what I mean efficacy on your product, you'll want to do this in the beginning anyway. And it's something that you can do much earlier than you could actually complete efficacy research.
So I just want to add something there. So just to kind of concretize this and give an example in terms of how it's not going to be about your product. Let's say, this is a really very simple example. Let's say your product incorporates a lot of video, right? It's video-based. There's a ton of research out there that supports the effectiveness of video in teaching X, Y, or Z, and that may be exactly what your product does. So we're going to cite that into that research. If there are multiple studies, we'll look for a meta-analysis, and we'll cite that and tie it back to your product. Okay, your product does X. and the research says using that approach is incredibly effective for a particular audience or particular grade level or whatever. So again, it's not about your product, but it ties to the research.
Another example would be in a case, let's say you're developing or have developed a product that incorporates 3 specific strategies or methods for supporting comprehension development with students. So if you can find research that establishes that each of these 3 methods are supported by research and are known to be effective, then that's going to help support your case. Now, Ellen will talk about where you find this research.
Yeah. So anyway, so what are the sources? I think some of these you may be aware of, and some not so much, because as researchers, these are the places that we go to find the information that we need. First, there are these research handbooks. They usually come out once a year, sometimes less often. When I was a math teacher, there was a yearly handbook that NCTM put out of the research in mathematics that we'd look at. Great source of research reviews. So that's first. Second, journals. I think everybody kind of knows about those. Peer-reviewed journals are the best. And the journals give you access to individual studies. They sometimes include research reviews, and they often include meta-analyses, which, we think of the meta-analyses, as Jay mentioned, as the holy grail. If you can find a meta-analysis that deals with some particular claim, that you're going to make about your product, that's really fabulous. The third source is dissertations. Dissertation abstracts is a database, other ways also to search dissertations. But what this provides, in addition to kind of the reporting of the study that the doctoral student did, oftentimes, or I would say almost always, having gone through this, is the doctoral students have to include a review of the literature as kind of chapter 1 of their dissertation. And oftentimes in the review of the literature, you'll find sources that are just perfect to support a claim. So dissertations are another good source. The next is books from education-focused publishers. And a lot of people don't even know about these, but publishers like Lawrence Erlbaum, Josie Bass, Sage, there are other university press publishers, put out books that that provide research documents, summaries of research, that kind of thing. And then finally, policy documents, which we probably all have seen those, but occasionally you'll find some research cited in those as well. And I'd say if any of you know of any other sources that we don't know about, in the box where you can put questions, let us know if you know of other sources of evidence for a research foundation's white paper as well.
We do have a question that came in, Ellen.
Great, great.
Do we have to get permission to use these sources if we're putting together this white paper for commercial purposes?
Good question. So you don't need permission, but you must cite the sources that you use. And in fact, it's in your interest to cite the sources because that's, makes your paper, your research foundation's white paper even stronger. What we often do, and we're going to give you some examples to look at and some links that you can go to in a minute, but what we often do is we cite the research and we include everything in footnotes. When you write the Research Foundation's white paper, you want people to be able to read it and understand it without putting the heavy-duty citations right in the paper. So we footnote all that so that if, in fact, there's somebody at the school district who is a real researcher and they want to follow up on the research and look at the actual research, they can track it down by the footnotes and go ahead and look at it. I hope that answers the question. If you have a follow-up on that, let us know. Okay.
Okay.
Yep. The other thing to keep in mind is that typically this kind of paper is going to summarize research, and if it uses quotes, they would be brief quotes, from the author's mouth. So those kinds of excerpts are acceptable.
Okay. So next, let's go on. And we're talking about how you find evidence for a Research Foundation's white paper. So how do you find those sources? First way is from curriculum experts. So these people, you may have curriculum experts that actually work in-house at your company. So you may be able to get information from them. You may also hire consultants to help you with that. So those are kind of two sources. The next would be recommendations from professional education organizations. We mentioned that when I talked about the handbooks before, but things like NCTM, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, ILA, the International Literacy Association, which was the IRA, they all publish books, journals, position papers. Those are all good things to look at. And then lastly, I don't know how many of you know about Google Scholar, but it's a database that you can also search. We look at that. It's kind of an offshoot of Google, the Google search engine, and it focuses just on academic publications. So you can go there and find things. There are also a number of proprietary databases, and those include things like ERIC, which a lot of people have heard of. That's the most common one probably. There's EBSCO, Education Source, another one called Science Direct. There is ProQuest Central. There are others as well. And again, if you know of some that we're not mentioning here that you want to share with our audience, that would be great to hear back from you on that. All right, and next we're going to talk a little bit about when you should develop a research foundation's white paper. So you probably have the sense from us by now that the best time to do it is when your product is in development. Okay, why is it best to do it then? Because you can incorporate the latest research into your product, right? If you do this later and your product is already developed, it's hard to go back and then incorporate the research. So doing it when your product is in development is the best. And I guess I have to say that often does not happen because companies are so focused on getting the product developed that they don't even think about doing this then. But we're here to say try to do that if you can. All right.
I just want to add something there, Ellen.
Yeah, by all means.
One of the issues is what division or what department in your organization is going to fund this. There are lots of companies that think of this as a marketing document, so it's only funded by marketing. But if somehow you can carve out a budget that is a combination of marketing funds and product development funds, you basically are using this research to make a better product, and then at the back end you're also using it to make a better marketing case.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jay, and this often comes up. So if you can think about that in advance, that would be great. So what usually happens is companies wait until the launch or sometime after launch, and they might decide to do this in-house. They might go to an outside research company like us and say, okay, we need to put this together. So they can go either way, as I said again, relying on their own internal people or going outside. I think that's about it on that. Jay, do you want to add anything there?
Just so that you understand that if you're doing it at the back end, it's kind of like a reverse engineering process. You might know some of the research from your in-house experts, what they relied on, but it's in your interest to go back and figure out what other research is out there that is in alignment with what you've done so that you can put it all out there.
So based on, you would just follow kind of what we just outlined, looking at the various sources, tracking them down, and so forth. We thought it might be helpful to give you some examples of Research Foundation white papers that we've done, and we included that on the next slide. And we've got some links there that you can go to. Okay, here we go. And you'll have copies of this, so you'll be able to click these links and look at them. One is a paper that we just actually released for the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital. And this paper supported they wanted us to write a paper that supported the claim that their new product, Learning Lab, supports deep, meaningful learning. So what we pulled together was research that included research and expert opinion on project-based learning, guided exploration of concepts and principles, and also guided development of academic skills. The paper, when you get to look at it, also presents research-based recommendations, which they wanted, and it also presents examples of teachers using authentic digital resources within this Learning Lab product to support deep and meaningful learning. I think that's a good one to take a look at. It's really current. Another one we did for veneer, which is what the research says about the value of probeware for science instruction. This paper presented support for several claims related to the use of technology tools for data collection, analysis, and visualization as part of science instruction. I won't go into too much detail there. You can take a look at that. But the things that we looked at were the use of technology tools that can provide a learning advantage to students as evidenced by student test scores in science. Also, the use of these tools to teach scientific practices and support scientific investigations, how that can help deepen student understanding of science concepts. And finally, the use of these tools is recommended in national and state standards and is consistent with the National Research Council's framework for K-12 science education, which some of you may know about. Finally, the paper went on to describe sample uses of Verneer's science tools aligned to the research, aligned to curriculum standards, aligned to the National Research Council's framework, which are all things that they wanted to put out so that when people looked at their product and their tools, they would see, again, how research-based it was. And I think they got great response to the paper. They used it for marketing. Their salespeople used it as a leave behind when they were making calls. They excerpted things from the white paper, so there are several ways that you can use it. Before we move on to talking about case studies, any other questions on Research Foundation white papers that come to your mind? Let us know. Jay, do you want to add anything there before we go on to case studies?
No, I think that's I think you've said it well.
Let's talk about case studies. Jay, you're going to take this one away?
Yeah. So we just want to kind of take you in brief over the process for doing case studies. We know that, some of you have been doing them, but this is focusing on case studies with supporting data. So the first step is to check in with your reps, your sales reps, your support reps. What you're trying to find are those districts and schools that, from their perspective, have positive achievement data after implementing your product. Now, they may not scrutinize the data the way research experts would, but you're looking for logical, possible candidates, promising candidates. And I think your sales and support reps who are really in touch with those folks are your best first place to look. Then you want to have research experts. They might be in-house. They might be, experts that you hire to actually look at the data and make sure there's a convincing data case to be made before you start the enterprise of interviewing folks at the district or the school to get the story. So then the next step is to find out who are the best people among the district staff to talk to and schedule interviews and then get those interviews underway. And besides focusing on their selection of the product.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? I just want to add
Absolutely.
one thing. When we do those interviews, we typically record them, and then we transcribe them because it's really difficult to capture everything while you're actually conducting the interview. So we record the interviews, we get them transcribed. It's easy that way for us to get quotes from the interviews and really focus on what the person is saying and follow up as opposed to trying to take notes. So I think that's important.
I like that point, and that does add some cost, but I think it's money well spent because also that way when you're quoting folks out there, you really do have the precise quotes. Now, they're going to talk very eloquently about how and why they selected the product, and they're also going to be able to talk. They're, in a sense, the experts on how they implemented the product. Sometimes you'll find someone in the district who also may have some special insight about student outcomes, things that don't show up in the data. So that's also something to keep in mind. And then you'll look to write a case study that combines narrative, quotes, data, and it's really useful to be able to present it both in narrative form and also in tables or graphs. And we also recommend considering at least compiling multiple case studies in a larger publication, because then it might allow you to draw some broader positive conclusions about your product. And you might use it both ways, individual case studies and also some compendium as well.
We've got a couple questions that have come in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one is, actually we've gotten this in a couple formats, but basically, when we reach out to the schools and the educators and ask about data, it seems like no one can ever get their hands on it or turn it over. So do you have any advice on how to kind of set the stage to kind of get the data that was needed to make these really powerful case studies?
Yeah. Well, if you keep in mind that for case studies, we're not looking for necessarily student-level data. Student-level data, the kind of data you would need for an efficacy study, those have to jump through higher hoops. These might be school-level data. They might be district-wide data. It's the kind of data that a lot of schools and districts are collecting themselves so that they have some kind of sense of, they're asking the question that New York City Mayor Koch used to ask, how am I doing? How we're doing, that kind of level of data. And they're usually doing it every year. So if they've got their own kind of positive data, then they ought to be, at that point, happy to share that with a wider public. The question is, can you find those districts that have that kind of data?
Yeah, that does seem to be the challenge. And somewhat related, does it make sense to really focus case studies more on a district level or a school administrator, or what are your thoughts on including, teacher level kind of feedback in these case studies?
Well, what's nice about being able to include teachers, then when you're talking about implementation, you're not just getting the high-level perspective. And when we think about people who might be enticed to read this, from their perspective, why are they reading it? They want to, kind of read about districts or schools that are in similar circumstances to theirs, and they're also kind of looking for tips or guidance as to how best to implement. So if you can not only get the administrator perspective, but also the teacher perspective, I think it makes for a more compelling story and a more valuable story for readers.
This next question is very interesting to me. Do you think that it helps or hurts the conversation with the customer if the sales rep is there during the interview? Because oftentimes it's the salesperson, not maybe the marketing or product person, that has that relationship. Does it seem less commercial if you don't have the rep there?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Yeah, we usually, it is a good question. Yeah, we've never actually had the rep there during the interview, and we typically do the interviews by phone. So they're not face-to-face in any case. But having the rep there, I think, does make it feel more commercial, more salesy. So I would recommend, doing it yourself, or having an outside person do it is even better.
Yeah, I think sometimes that third-party perspective can help the educators feel comfortable about talking as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this is not something you necessarily are looking forward to, but it's kind of like a fail-safe device. If you're dealing with an outside interviewer, every so often you will find that there is something about the implementation that's not going like you thought it was going, and that might be a red flag that the story that you're planning is something that maybe we ought to get someone in there and help them with the implementation before we continue this project, and that's really important. That has happened to us on occasion.
Yeah, that's good when we find that out, passing that on to our client. Sometimes they're surprised, but it's good for them to know that.
Yeah, I think there's an added benefit there of kind of getting some product feedback.
And they might share it with an independent rather than with the actual folks who work for the client.
Yeah, I think, again, the educators are just more maybe willing to be fully open about how things are going.
Yes, that's true, Em.
Yeah. So this question is asking, I guess, really about not necessarily relying on the school's data. Would it make sense to start with a pre-assessment followed by a post-assessment to show growth rather than just relying on the school's records.
You'd want some kind of pre-data and post-data. Sometimes that can be, sometimes the pre and the post for this purpose can be what happened last year versus what's happening this year. You know, it's not at the same level of data that you might want for an efficacy study. But if you, let's say you're focusing on middle school grades 6 through 8, how did our 6 through 8 graders do relative to, let's say, a high-stakes test last year, and now how did they do this year? Now, they're not all the same students, but it does give a sense of how the district is, what direction the district is going in.
Right,
a lot of times that data is available.
Yeah, and I think, again, part of it is probing for it and knowing what to ask for and helping
Absolutely.
the folks you're interviewing get it to you. It looks like we've run out of questions on the case studies, and we're starting to get close on time, so we better move on ahead.
All right, let's pick up on speed, Jay.
All right, so we'll look at the next slide, but we probably won't spend a lot of time with it. So we just want to point out that we have a couple of examples of case studies that we've done. I don't think we have time to describe them for you, but you might want to go take a look at those.
Yeah, okay. So next slide.
Okay, so here we just wanted to take you quickly through the process of actually doing efficacy research. So the first thing you're going to do is choose a research partner. They should be education focused. They should have a track record in research. You want to develop a research plan. That plan should talk about the goals of the research questions, what student populations you're going to focus on. You should be making some preliminary decisions about the measures, the assessments you're going to use, although that could be subject to change. And then you also want to have at least preliminary plans for data analysis. Once you're armed with at least a preliminary research plan, then you can go about recruiting districts and schools to participate. And those can be districts or schools that your the client you already have in your kind of cadre of customers, or it may be a district or school that a researcher can bring in. Then you want to make final decisions about selecting or developing research instruments, and sometimes there may not be a published instrument available for the specific focus you have in mind. But if you can find a research instrument that's already out there, then it's already should have established reliability and validity, which makes it better for a research enterprise. You want to make sure that the teachers are trained to implement the study, and that's usually you as the publisher or the provider of the product. You would provide that training. We want to collect baseline data. It would be a combination of student demographics and prior achievement data. Then you go about implementing that product for however long the study is going to take place. And then you're conducting research during that implementation and after the implementation. During the implementation, you probably want to somehow track what we call implementation fidelity. There's probably a recommended way and timing and amount of dosage, if you will, of the product. You want to make sure that teachers are actually doing it, and then after you want to see what kind of outcomes, what kind of impacts. And then you analyze the data and you start writing up reports and other kinds of informational pieces around it.
Yeah, one thing I would add
Any questions there?
Yeah. Before we do questions, yeah, I would just say that one of the really key things is when you recruit districts or schools to participate, be really clear with them and get some sort of memo of understanding that says what they're committing to and what you are committing to. So I just want to stress that. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide.
We do have a couple questions.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. What's the optimal time period for this type of study? Sort of the shortest and longest that you could look at?
You know, I would say for a program that is intended to be a year-long program, then you probably want to let it run a full year. And I realize that that's a challenge in terms of, you know, kind of time for using it for marketing purposes. But you may be able to do some research on pieces of a program if those pieces don't depend on other pieces of the program or other sections of the program. But usually it's going to depend on how long the actual implementation of the entire program normally is expected to take.
Okay. And do you recommend, I guess, the pros and cons of potentially making participation in an efficacy study part of the requirements of a pilot project?
Good question.
You know, I think if you've got a, if you're talking about a pilot project where you're giving them the resources and you're not, there's no cost to them, this might make sense, especially if it's a critical program. Something that is critical to a district's enterprise. That can work. Sometimes it'll be therefore a smaller bore study. It won't be the entire district or may not even be the entire school. I'd say for those kinds of pilot studies, we might include something like 6 to 10 classrooms, those kinds of things.
Okay.
And then it makes sense for the district as well because they're actually going to get some data about their specific situation and whether this made a difference.
And one last question before we move along.
Okay.
If we are a small ed tech startup without a lot of funding at this point to get a third party involved in the research, would it still be considered valid and good if we had a research intern assist with a project like this?
Something is better than nothing. That's all I can say. I mean, financial constraints are real. I think Jay mentioned fidelity of implementation. I think that's one of the most important things, that you have a model for how your product should be used and be sure that the teachers are using it that way. And, whatever you can do, again, is better than nothing. So.
One possibility to consider, and there are some additional hoops to go through there, at a relatively low cost, you might be able to get someone to do a dissertation on your product if it's kind of aligns with what their focus is anyway. And then you're getting the...
That's gonna take a long time to get a dissertation done. So if you need something quickly,
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So I think we should move on. I'm right in the interest of time.
Yes, I think we're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, just a quick thing on disseminating your efficacy research. Okay, there's 3 kinds of things you can do, and we're going to show you some samples of this that you can look at on your own. One is a formal research report. You write the whole thing up, methods, methodology, outcomes, all that. Talk about what you've done statistically. Next is a research summary, which kind of gives the highlights of the research, but still keeping it kind of researchy, as opposed to the third one, which is highlights for marketing and sales, where you pull out the kind of bullet points that your sales people can use. Just to give you on the next slide, I know Jay's going to talk about this, but we've got some samples there. Jay, you want to go through that quickly?
Yeah, well, we just put one example of an efficacy research project. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Fluency Formula. It was a developmental approach to teaching fluency. It featured repeated oral reading, phonics drills, text passages that had cues for how to phrase it, fluency readers, intensive vocabulary work, and continuous fluency assessment. So it included all the materials that the teacher needed, that the students needed. It included an oral fluency assessment system and a library of leveled books. And so what we were able to do is actually do random assignment of classes. We were not able to strategically assign students randomly, but we could assign classes randomly. And so there was a fluency formula treatment group, and there was a comparison group that didn't use fluency formula. And the achievement measure was a very simple, typical data point you get from oral fluency assessments, words correct per minute. So that's actually well known in the fluency world. And we were able to find results significantly superior gains on oral fluency for the fluency formula group compared to the other group.
Jay?
In some ways, yep.
Yeah, I was just going to interrupt you here. I'm looking at time. We have about 9 minutes left. I was going to suggest that perhaps people have that link so they can go to that and look at the details on it, you know, and maybe that we should move on. Your feeling
Yeah,
about
the only
that?
other point I want to make there is that high fidelity of teacher implementation is something that some research forgets to focus on. And you want some evidence that the teachers really did the program.
Right. So you keep hearing us say high, fidelity of implementation. So we really want you to take that away from this presentation. All right. Let's move on to the next slide. We'll get through these last few quickly.
Okay, here's just a quick list of the various ways you can use evidence-based marketing. You know, highlights for your marketing communications, websites, social media, print materials, talking points for reps for sales, sales presentations, conference sessions, when salespeople are talking on the phone, press releases, short articles that can be leave-behinds, that can be on your website. Then we've also talked about this before. If you can condense research summaries that can go right into grant proposals, that's a way of supporting how people are going to pay for a product. We talked about Research Foundation white papers, and we also talked about those formal research reports. Why do you need that big formal research report? Well, when you start to go to mid-size and especially large districts, they're going to have a research director, and that might be the person who really wants to dig into the formal report and kind of kick the tires of the report.
Good. Great summary, Jay. Okay, so a quick poll now. Which type of, given what we talked about, which type of evidence-based research would be most valuable for your organization? Foundations, case studies with data, efficacy, other. Okay, so that poll should appear on your screen now. Okay, in a minute we'll look at the results. And we just have one more slide after this to do, and we'll see if you have any last questions. So while you're, oh, there we go. Okay, so case studies is it again, not surprising, right? Okay, now efficacy research went up to 33%, so it looks like you all see the importance of that, okay? All right, I think we can move on. I don't think we have anything else to say about that. We have just one more slide that we want to talk about, and that slide is talking about finding the right research partner. So let's take a look at that. There we go. Okay, finding the right research partner. This is really key, and we're assuming that you're going to work with an outside partner to do an independent researcher to do efficacy research. So the first is obviously you want somebody who's conducted this type of research before, and they're good at it, and you've read some research studies that they've done, and you feel that they're well put together. The second is to find someone who really knows the education market and the education business. And in sync with this is someone who has prior experience as an educator. This is really valuable. You know, somebody who's been in the classroom, who knows how schools work, who knows how to talk to teachers. I can't stress that one enough. Also someone who's experienced with working with the kind of group you have, whether you're a startup. I know we have some people on the phone who are startups. If you're a nonprofit, large publisher, small publisher, just somebody who's experienced at working with your type of organization. And finally, you want an outside research firm that's experienced at communicating with a large range of education stakeholders, because you're going to have to prepare materials, or they're going to prepare materials that talk to district level people, talk to Board of Education people, talk to teachers. It's really important when you put your research together that you have some kind of document, and that your partner can put it together that communicates with the gatekeepers. There are a lot of people that are going to want to read about your research that are not researchers, that can't deal with what I call researchy kinds of documents. So you want somebody who can write something for the gatekeepers so that they come away knowing that your product is research-based, research-supported, but they don't have to delve into all the details of the research to understand that. And that's, I think, where we're going to end it. It's 1:56. If you have any last questions, or Emily, if you want to do a wrap-up, The last slide just has our contact information. We're happy to hear from you. If you have questions on any of the things we cited, or feel free to download those and take a look at them.
Great. Thank you so much to both Ellen and Jay for sharing all this information. And I'm excited to take a look at some of those studies that I haven't had a chance to yet. I've got several clients that work closely with IESD and Ellen and Jay, and I can just tell you firsthand the quality of the work that they do and the insight that they bring about the market, and specifically the types of information you really need to be gathering and sharing with educators to get your product into their hands. So I encourage you to learn more about them through their work, and also reach out to Ellen and Jay if you've got questions or would like assistance with any of these types of projects, because they are definitely
And even if you
top-notch.
don't need assistance, we're happy to talk with you and just kind of explore options and help you think things through.
That's great. So just as a reminder, we are going to send an email tomorrow with a link to the recording as well as to these slides, so you'll be able to get those samples from them. Before I totally wrap up, we do have another question that came in, and I think this is in regards to the case studies.
Okay.
If you were doing a non-cognitive survey within a case study, does that have to be created by an outside researcher?
A non-cognitive, say that again, a non-cognitive
survey within a case study. And I can ask
I think if you can have somebody independent of your organization develop it, it's just a stronger piece of evidence from the point of view of people who are going to read the case study.
Okay. And it looks like that answered her question, so great.
Great. So I want to thank you all, and thank you, Emily and Suzanne, for including us in this. It was great.
We appreciate
Wonderful.
it. Thank you.
Yes, and we appreciate your time and all the information you shared. Just for everyone out there, our next webinar is April 20th. We're going to have Doug Messakar join us, and he's going to unpack what we know and what we don't know about changes at the DOE, as well as the ongoing implementation of ESSA in districts across the country. So keep an eye out for more information about that webinar, as well as the registration details. And thanks again for everyone's participation today. We had some great questions, and it was a fun dialogue. So have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.